The air in the high desert is thin and sharp, smelling of dust and distance. For Jedediah Stone, it smells of failure. His mule, Daisy, favors her left foreleg, and his own stomach is a hollow cavern echoing with the memory of his last hardtack biscuit. He sits on a sun-bleached rock, the cracked leather of his boots a testament to 1,000 miles of fruitless searching. Below him, the territory sprawls out, a brutal, beautiful expanse of ochre mesas and spiny cholla that has promised everything and given nothing. He is a man whittled down to his last nerve, his dreams eroded to grit, same as the sandstone all around him. He is about to pack it in, to swallow the bitter taste of defeat and crawl back to some town to beg for work, when he sees it. Not a flicker of gold, but a wisp of smoke, impossibly thin, rising from a crevice in the canyon wall he'd thought impassable. Curiosity, the prospector's oldest and most dangerous friend, nudges him to his feet. Leading the limping Daisy, he makes his way toward that fragile, gray thread, a signal of life in a land that feels determined to grant him only a grave. There's more to this character than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. The smoke leads him to a place hidden from the world, a shallow alcove carved by wind and water, shielded by a curtain of ancient, gnarled juniper. Before it sits a man, older than the sun-scorched rocks themselves. His face is a roadmap of 100 hard years, his skin the color of rich earth, and his eyes are closed, covered by a milky film that speaks of a long-ended conversation with light. He is Apache. That much is clear from the simple buckskin leggings and the quiet dignity that surrounds him like a shroud. He does not stir as Jed approaches, yet Jed feels seen, scrutinized by a sense other than sight. An old cooking pot simmers over a tiny, smokeless fire, and the scent of herbs and roasted rabbit makes Jed's stomach clench with a painful, desperate longing. He has stumbled into the heart of a world he was taught to fear, yet he feels no menace, only a profound and unnerving stillness. The old man finally turns his head, his blind eyes seeming to focus on the space Jed occupies. He speaks, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "You are hungry," he says, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Your spirit is as empty as your belly." Jed can only nod, his own voice lost somewhere in his throat. The old man gestures to the fire. "Eat. Then we will speak of the yellow tears the mountain weeps." And with those words, a piece of dried leather is held out, a map etched in charcoal and berry juice. And Jedediah's life, a thing he was ready to discard, is irrevocably changed. Jedediah Stone had come west not for adventure, but in retreat. He was fleeing the ghost of a Pennsylvania farm buried under debt and the quieter, more persistent ghost of a wife and child buried under cold earth. He was a man hollowed out by loss, and he'd thought to fill the void with gold. He imagined it as a physical act, packing the raw, heavy metal of the earth into the empty spaces of his soul until the sheer weight of it silenced the echoes. For 2 years, he had chased the rumor and the dream, from the muddy sluices of Colorado to the scorched arroyos of Arizona. He'd found nothing but a deeper kind of emptiness, a solitude so profound it had its own sound, the whisper of wind over rock, the ceaseless thrum of his own blood in his ears. The men he met in the boom towns that pockmarked the territory were a different breed. They were loud, voracious, their eyes glittering with a fever that had nothing to do with sickness and everything to do with the soul. They were men like Silas Kane, a thick-shouldered brute with a predator's smile and a reputation for jumping claims with a bullet if words didn't suffice. Jed had seen him in dusty saloons, his voice a low rumble as he boasted of his finds, his eyes constantly scanning the room, assessing, weighing, looking for weakness. Men like Kane were the reason Jed prospected alone, far from the established camps. He did not have the stomach for their brand of ambition. His desperation was a quiet, aching thing, not a weapon to be wielded against others. The last town he'd passed through, a miserable collection of tents, and clapboard shacks called Purgatory Flats had been thick with them. They'd looked at his worn-out gear, his lame mule, and the hope-scoured look on his face, and they had dismissed him with sneers and scornful pity. He was another failure, another piece of human driftwood washed up on the shores of the great American dream. The old Apache, who told Jed his name was Nache, which meant he who sleeps, seemed to see none of that. Or perhaps he saw all of it and looked past it into the man Jedediah had been before the hollowing out. As Jed ate the savory rabbit stew, the first real meal he'd had in a month, Nache spoke not of gold, but of the land. He spoke of it as a living thing, with a memory that stretched back to the first sunrise. His blindness, Jed realized, was not a deficiency. It had given him a different kind of sight, one that perceived the currents of life and spirit that flowed through the rock and the sand. The alcove was not a home. It was a listening post. The white men dig in the earth like frantic badgers, Nache said, his voice soft but resonant. They tear the skin of the mother to find the veins of yellow metal. They do not understand. The gold is not a treasure. It is a poison. It is the solidified sorrow of the mountain, a place where a great tragedy once happened. To take it is to take that sorrow into your own heart. Jed held the map, the leather cool and supple against his calloused palm. The markings were not like any map he'd ever seen. They were less about direction and more about relation. A curve that represented a sleeping mountain, a series of dots that followed the path of a certain constellation, a wavy line that was not a river, but the shadow a particular rock formation cast at midday. It was a map of instinct and observation, not of measurement. "Why give this to me?" Jed asked, his voice rough from disuse. Nache was silent for a long moment, his head tilted as if listening to a reply on the wind. "Your footsteps are heavy," he finally said, "but they are quiet. You do not seek to conquer the land. You seek to hide within it. Perhaps a man who understands hiding will understand what needs to be protected." He made a gesture that encompassed the vast, silent landscape. "The place on this map, it is a place of peace, a place for remembering. The yellow tears should be left to wash back into the earth. But the other men, the loud men, will come soon. They follow the scent of greed like vultures to a carcass. I am too old to stop them. But you have the hunger of a wolf, but not its heart. I give you this choice. You can feast on a mountain's sorrow, or you can be its guardian." The weight of the map in Jed's hand seemed to increase. It was no longer a simple promise of wealth. It was a burden, a test. He looked from the blind, knowing face of the old man to the vast, unforgiving wilderness. He was a man who had lost everything. What did he have left to offer as a guardian? And yet, for the first time in years, a flicker of something other than despair ignited within him. It felt perilously like purpose. He folded the map carefully and tucked it inside his shirt. The next morning, after sharing a breakfast of roasted corn and leaving behind half of his own meager supply of coffee beans, an inadequate offering he felt ashamed to make, he led Daisy away from the alcove, not toward the town of Purgatory Flats, but deeper into the Chiricahua Mountains, following the language of shadows and stars. The journey was a trial, a pilgrimage guided by a cryptic scripture of the land. For 3 days, Jed traveled, his skepticism warring with a nascent, unfamiliar faith in Nache's wisdom. The map forced him to see the world differently. He stopped thinking in miles and compass points and started thinking in the subtle shifts of the sun, the shapes of the wind-scoured hoodoos, the way the flora changed with the elevation. He was not conquering the terrain. He was learning its dialect. He felt a strange sense of being watched, not with malice, but with a deep, ancient curiosity. He would catch a glimpse of a gray wolf moving silently along a ridge, its eyes meeting his for a moment before it melted back into the landscape. He felt as though the land itself was assessing him, weighing his intent against the legacy of Nache's trust. On the 4th day, guided by the instruction to find the place where the hawk sleeps at noon, he found himself in a narrow, box canyon he would have otherwise dismissed as impassable. A lone, towering spire of rock cast a shadow that looked, with a bit of imagination, like a perched raptor. He followed the canyon as it twisted and turned, the walls rising steeply on either side, muffling the ever-present wind. The air grew cooler, damper, and then he heard it, the gentle, musical sound of running water. He rounded a final bend, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a place of impossible beauty, a secret garden hidden in the heart of the stone desert. A narrow creek, fed by a hidden spring, trickled over a bed of smooth, dark stones. Maidenhair ferns grew in lush clusters along the damp banks, and the water was so clear he could see every pebble on the bottom. It was a sanctuary, a vibrant, living jewel set in the harshness of the surrounding territory. He knelt by the water's edge, plunging his hands into the cold, clear stream. As he brought them up, something glittered in his palm. It wasn't a speck. It was a flake of gold, the size of his thumbnail, so pure and bright it seemed to hum with its own internal light. He scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. He grabbed his prospecting pan, his hands trembling with an excitement that bordered on pain. He scooped up a panful of gravel from the creek bed, sloshed the water, and watched as the lighter sand and pebbles washed away. What was left in the bottom took his breath away. It wasn't dust. It was a thick, heavy carpet of gold flakes, nuggets, and wires, more than he had seen in 2 years of back-breaking labor. Every pan was the same. The creek bed was saturated with it. It was a bonanza, a king's ransom lying naked under the sun. The elation was a physical force, a wave that washed over him, cleansing him of all the desperation, all the failure. He laughed, a raw, cracked sound that echoed strangely in the quiet canyon. He was rich. He could go back east, buy a new farm, build a new life. He could erase the past. He could fill the hollow spaces. But as he stood there, his boots sinking into the soft, damp earth, Nache's words returned to him, as clear as the water at his feet. The solidified sorrow of the mountain. To take it is to take that sorrow into your own heart. He looked around the verdant, peaceful canyon. He saw the delicate ferns, the clear water, the way the light filtered down from the sliver of blue sky above. It did not feel like a place of sorrow. It felt like a place of healing. But as he looked at the raw, gleaming metal in his pan, he felt a sudden, sharp pang of unease. It felt like a violation, a desecration. He was a thief in a cathedral. The need for supplies was unavoidable. To extract the gold, even a small portion of it, he needed mercury to amalgamate the fine flakes, canvas for pouches, and more food than he could carry. The thought of returning to Purgatory Flats filled him with a cold dread. The town was a spider's web, and every man in it was a hungry spider. Discretion was paramount. He cached his main tools and the small pouch of gold he'd collected, burying them under a rockfall far from the creek itself. He made his camp appear as sparse and unsuccessful as ever, then started the long, slow journey back toward the world of men. He entered Purgatory Flats, leading a still limping Daisy, affecting the same weary, defeated posture he'd had before. But something was different, and he knew it. A secret, especially a secret as heavy as gold, changes a man's bearing. He kept his eyes down, his hat brim low, but he could feel the casual glances of the other prospectors lingering on him. He went to the general store, a cluttered, dusty establishment run by a man named Henderson, whose weary eyes had seen 100 men like Jed come and go. Jed bought flour, beans, and jerky, the standard fare of a down-on-his-luck prospector. Then, trying to make it seem like an afterthought, he asked for a small flask of mercury and some heavy canvas. Henderson paused, his hand hovering over the shelf. He looked at Jed, a long, appraising look. "Mercury," he said, his voice neutral but his eyes sharp. "Figured you were about ready to give it up. Found a little sign." Jed mumbled, cursing himself. His voice sounded too tight. "Probably nothing. Just want to be sure before I pack it in for good." Henderson slid the heavy, corked bottle across the counter, along with the folded canvas. "Be careful with that sign, son," he said, his voice low. "This town has long ears, and some of them belong to Silas Kane." As if summoned by the name, the bat-winged doors of the saloon across the street swung open, and Kane himself stepped out, flanked by two of his cronies. Kane's eyes, small and hard like chips of obsidian, swept the street. They landed on Jed as he exited the store, and for a heart-stopping second, Jed was certain the man could see the gold dust still clinging to the creases in his soul. Kane's gaze was like a physical weight. He noted the new supplies, the slight stiffness in Jed's posture, the way Jed avoided his eyes. A slow, predatory smile spread across Kane's face. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He simply watched Jed lead his mule out of town, the look in his eyes a clear and chilling promise. The secret was already bleeding out. The return to the canyon was fraught with a new kind of tension. Jed felt watched, and he knew it was no longer the spirits of the land or the silent wolves. Now, it was the avarice of men that stalked him. He took a longer, more circuitous route, doubling back on his own trail, using every trick he knew to hide his path. When he finally arrived back at the hidden sanctuary, the sense of peace was gone, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. The beautiful canyon no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a trap. He worked with a feverish intensity, driven now not by the dream of wealth, but by the fear of losing it. The work was grueling. He spent his days in the cold creek, his back screaming in protest, his hands raw from the gravel and the heavy amalgam. The gold accumulated, heavy pouch after heavy pouch, but the joy he'd anticipated was absent. Each nugget he pulled from the earth felt less like a discovery and more like a theft. The weight of the gold in his saddlebags was matched by the growing weight in his gut. He began to notice things he'd overlooked in his initial gold-fueled delirium. Near the head of the spring, half buried in the soft earth, were a series of smooth, flat stones arranged in a circle. In the center, he found a small, exquisitely carved piece of turquoise, shaped like a water bird. Not far from there, tucked into a crevice in the canyon wall, he discovered shards of pottery, the clay painted with intricate, faded designs that mirrored the constellations on Nache's map. This was more than just a place with gold. This was a place. It had a history, a purpose that predated his own fleeting desires by centuries. This was the place of remembering Nache had spoken of. He imagined generations of Apache coming here, seeking solace in the shade and the cool water, leaving these small tokens of reverence. And here he was, tearing it apart from metal. The thought soured the taste of his food and haunted his sleep. He tried to be careful, to minimize his impact. He refilled the holes he dug, replaced the stones he moved. But his work was still a scar. The clear water of the creek was now perpetually clouded with the silt he stirred up. He was a wound on the skin of this sacred place. One afternoon, as he was panning near the spring, he unearthed something different. It was a small, leather-wrapped bundle, heavy for its size. He carefully unwrapped it. Inside were the fragile, desiccated remains of a newborn's moccasins, no bigger than his thumb, beaded with a pattern of a single blue star. The sorrow Nache had spoken of suddenly became real, a tangible thing that chilled him to the bone. This was a grave site, a place of mourning. The gold was not the mountain's sorrow. It was the offering, the tears meant to sanctify this ground. And he was stealing them. He rewrapped the bundle with trembling hands and buried it again, deeper this time, marking the spot with a single white stone. He couldn't work any more that day. He sat by his fire, the growing pile of gold pouches seeming to mock him from the shadows. He had come west to fill a void left by a wife and child taken by sickness. Now he was standing on the grave of another man's child, desecrating it for profit. The hollowness inside him returned, deeper and more painful than before. A few days later, his worst fears were realized. He had climbed to the rim of the canyon to survey the surrounding land, a habit born of his growing paranoia. Far in the distance, he saw a plume of dust. A single rider, sitting motionless on a ridge, a tiny silhouette against the vast blue sky. The man was too far away to be identified, but Jed didn't need to see his face. He knew. Someone was tracking him. The hunt had begun. The paranoia became a constant companion, a second shadow that clung to him even in the deepest parts of the canyon. Every snap of a twig, Every rustle of leaves in the wind sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He stopped lighting fires at night, eating his food cold. He slept in fits and starts, his hand always on the worn grip of his Colt. The sanctuary had become a prison, and the gold, a set of heavy, glittering chains. He knew he couldn't stay. He had to get the gold out and disappear. But the thought of leaving, of abandoning the canyon to whatever fate awaited it, felt like a betrayal. He was caught between his own desperate need for a future and an unexpected, fiercely protective loyalty to this place's past. The breaking point came a week later. He was packing his gear, resolved to leave under the cover of the next moonless night, when he heard the scrape of iron horseshoes on rock, not from the canyon entrance, but from the rim above. He doused his small cook fire and scrambled for cover behind a cluster of boulders, his rifle in hand. Two men appeared on the ledge overlooking his camp. One was a scrawny, rat-faced man he recognized from Purgatory Flats. The other was Silas Kane. They didn't come down. They didn't have to. Kane scanned the camp, his eyes taking in the sluice box by the creek, the freshly disturbed gravel. The whole operation laid bare. He looked directly at the spot where Jed was hiding, though Jed knew he couldn't be seen. Kane's lips curled into that familiar, predatory smile. "Looks like the whisperings were true, boys," Kane called out, his voice booming in the enclosed space. He wasn't speaking to the man beside him, but to others unseen. Our quiet friend, Mr. Stone, found himself a pretty little nest. He spat a stream of tobacco juice over the edge. It landed near the spring where Jed had found the prayer stones. "We're just looking for some stray cattle, Stone," he yelled, the lie thick with mockery. "Wouldn't want to disturb you. You just keep working. We'll be back to check on your progress." With a final, contemptuous laugh, he and the other man disappeared from the rim. The threat was no longer a distant dust cloud or a feeling of being watched. It was here. It had a name and a face, and it had promised to return. Jedediah knew he was out of time. He couldn't outrun them, and he couldn't outfight them. Kane would be back, and not with 2 men, but with 12. They would take the gold, they would likely kill him, and they would tear the canyon apart until not a single fern, not a single prayer stone was left. They would obliterate the memory that resided here. He packed a single bag with food, his water skin, and left the gold. He left all of it, every last heavy pouch, sitting in a neat pile by the cold ashes of his fire. He looked at it for a long moment, the source of all his hope and all his misery. It meant nothing now. He made his way out of the canyon, not back towards Purgatory Flats, but deeper into the mountains, back toward the only person who might understand the choice he was about to make. He had to see Nache. He didn't know if he was seeking an answer or forgiveness, or simply the solace of another human presence who understood that some things were more valuable than gold. The journey back to Nache's alcove was a flight. Jed pushed himself and Daisy relentlessly, fueled by a desperate urgency. When he finally arrived, stumbling into the small clearing, he found the old man sitting exactly as he had left him, as if he were a part of the rock formation itself. Jed didn't need to speak. His exhaustion, his fear, and his defeat were a palpable aura around him. He collapsed by the fire pit, the story of his failure written in every line of his body. He had failed as a guardian. He offered Nache the last of his jerky. The old man accepted it with a quiet nod. They sat in a silence that stretched for an hour, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the juniper. Jed felt the tightness in his chest begin to loosen, the frantic drumming of his heart slowing to a steadier rhythm. Finally, Nache spoke, his voice calm and even. "The loud men have found the place of tears." It wasn't a question. Jed just nodded, his throat too tight to form words. "The sorrow will spread now," Nache continued, his blind eyes turned toward the distant mountains. "It is a sickness. It would draw more of them. They will make the mountain bleed." "I left the gold," Jed rasped, the words tearing at him. "All of it. But they'll still find it. They'll destroy the place." "The gold is not the heart of the place," Nache said softly. "It is only the blood. The heart is the water and the stone and the memory. You cannot carry the heart of a mountain in a pouch." The old man reached out a hand, his dry, wrinkled fingers finding Jed's shoulder. The touch was surprisingly firm, anchoring. You did not fail as a guardian. You have only just learned what it is you are meant to guard. It is not the gold. It is the peace. A profound shift occurred within Jedediah. The last vestiges of the gold fever, the desperate yearning that had driven him for 2 years, finally broke and washed away. He was no longer a prospector. He was not a man running from his past. He was a man with a choice. He could run again, disappear into the territory, and let the canyon be consumed. Or he could stand his ground, not for ownership, not for wealth, but for the quiet sanctity of a place that had shown him the true poverty of his own soul. He looked at Nache, at the calm, resolute dignity on the old man's face. He knew what he had to do. There might be a way, Jed said, his voice finding a new strength. Not to save the gold, to bury it, to give it back to the mountain. Nache's head tilted, a flicker of interest in his serene expression. Jed began to speak, his mind racing, piecing together his knowledge of the canyon, the steep, unstable scree slopes on the northern rim, the way the creek narrowed at the entrance, the signs of past rockfalls. He remembered the storms he'd witnessed in these mountains, how a gentle rain could turn into a raging torrent in minutes, how the very landscape could be reshaped by the power of water and gravity. A desperate, dangerous plan began to form in his mind. He couldn't fight Silas Kane and his men with guns, but he could fight them with the mountain itself. He would make Nache's words literal. He would make the mountain weep, not with tears of gold, but with a deluge of rock and earth that would seal the canyon forever. It was a fool's gambit, a suicidal mission, and it was the only honorable path left to him. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a dark, churning mass of purple and gray that promised violence. A storm was coming, not the gentle, life-giving rain that nurtured the ferns in the hidden canyon, but a furious, driving squall, the kind that turned dry arroyos into raging rivers. Jed could taste the ozone in the air, could feel the electric tension on his skin. It was perfect. The storm would be his accomplice. He left Daisy safely tethered in a sheltered box canyon miles away, a silent promise to return that he wasn't sure he could keep. He made his way back to the Canyon of Tears on foot, moving like a wraith through the dusk, his rifle slung over his shoulder and a length of sturdy rope coiled over the other. He wasn't thinking about the gold anymore. He was thinking of the child's moccasins, of the prayer stones, of the profound peace he had briefly felt beside the clear, running water. He was fighting for a memory that wasn't his own. He reached the canyon rim just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Below, the scene was one of brutal desecration. At least a dozen men swarmed the canyon floor, their lanterns casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the walls. At their center, directing the chaos with savage glee, was Silas Kane. They had ripped the creek bed to shreds, tossing aside the ancient stones, tearing up the delicate ferns. The once clear water ran thick and brown with mud. They had already amassed a staggering pile of gold, which glinted greedily in the lantern light. The sight filled Jed not with envy, but with a cold, righteous fury. They were not just miners, they were grave robbers. Jed didn't waste time. He moved along the northern rim, to the place he'd identified earlier. The slope here was steep and treacherous, a loose agglomeration of rock and soil held together by little more than gravity and stubbornness. Signs of older slides were everywhere. It was a place waiting to fall. He found what he was looking for, a massive, precariously balanced boulder, a keystone holding a significant portion of the slope in place. Dislodging it would trigger a chain reaction, an avalanche of rock and earth that would cascade into the narrow canyon below, damming the creek and burying everything. He secured his rope around a solid rock anchor and began his descent, planting his feet carefully on the slick, rain-soaked scree. The wind howled around him, plucking at his clothes, trying to tear him from his perch. Below, the men were oblivious, their shouts of discovery and greed swallowed by the rising storm. He reached the keystone boulder and began to work, using the butt of his rifle as a lever, jamming it into a crack and heaving with all his might. The rock groaned, shifted, but held fast. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead, running in cold rivulets down his face and back. He heaved again, his muscles screaming, his breath coming in ragged gasps. A shout from below cut through the storm's roar. Up there, on the rim, he'd been spotted. A lantern beam sliced through the darkness, pinning him against the rock face. For a moment, he was a moth caught in a jar. "It's Stone," Kane's voice bellowed, raw with fury. "Kill the bastard. He's trying to bury us." A gunshot cracked, the bullet whining past Jed's ear and smacking into the rock beside him, showering him with stone splinters. The time for subtlety was over. He ignored the shots that followed, the lead slugs kicking up dust and rock around him, and threw his entire body into one last, desperate effort. With a deep, grinding shudder that he felt through the soles of his boots, the keystone boulder broke free. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like the world cracking open, the entire slope gave way. It wasn't a slide, it was a liquidation. A river of rock, mud, and debris poured over the canyon edge. Jed scrambled back up the rope, his hands raw, his lungs burning. He didn't look back. He could hear the terrifying roar of the landslide, a sound of immense, geological power that drowned out the storm and the panicked screams of the men below. He hauled himself over the ledge just as the ground he'd been standing on crumbled and fell away into the abyss. He lay on the flat rock of the rim, gasping for air, the rain washing over him like a baptism. He crawled to the edge and looked down. The canyon was gone. Where there had been a creek, a camp, and a crowd of greedy men, there was now a massive, steaming dam of rock and mud. The lantern light had been extinguished. The shouts had been silenced. The creek water, already rising behind the new dam, was beginning to pool, forming a dark, still lake. He didn't know if he had killed them. He had not aimed for them, but for the creek. Their fate was in the hands of God and their own foolishness. He had done what he had to do. He had given the gold and the sorrow back to the mountain. As he watched, a new sound began to echo in the transformed canyon. The rush of the flash flood, the rainwater for miles around, now channeled into the creek bed, surging against the landslide dam. The place of tears was being washed clean, its memory sealed forever beneath tons of earth and a new, dark lake. Jed felt a profound exhaustion settle over him, so deep it felt as though it reached his very bones. But underneath it, there was no regret. There was no sense of loss for the fortune he had just buried. There was only a quiet, stark sense of peace. He had faced the hollow man he had become and had chosen to fill the emptiness not with gold, but with an act of preservation. He had honored his pact with Nache. He turned his back on the sealed canyon and began the long walk through the storm, leaving the ghosts of greed to be buried by the rising water. The walk back to Nache's alcove was a journey through a landscape scrubbed clean by the storm. The air was cool and crisp, the dust settled, the sky a brilliant, aching blue. Jedediah felt as if he, too, had been washed clean. The frantic, desperate energy that had propelled him for years was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady calm. He was bruised, scraped, and utterly spent, but he felt whole in a way he hadn't since before the farm, before the sickness, before the graves. He found Nache sitting by the entrance to his shelter, a thin blanket over his shoulders, his face turned to the east, as if watching the sunrise he could only feel. He didn't turn as Jed approached. There was no need. Jed sank to the ground beside him, the silence between them comfortable, complete. He had no words to explain what had happened, and he knew none were required. They sat like that for a long time, two silent figures watching the day be born. The sun crested the distant mesas, spilling liquid gold light across the desert floor. The rivers of light flowed into the canyons, painting the red rock in hues of fire and honey. Finally, Nache spoke, his voice as soft as the morning air. "The mountain sleeps again," he said. It was not a question, it was a benediction. "Her tears are dry." Jed could only nod, a lump forming in his throat. He looked at his hands, calloused and scraped from his fight with the mountain. They were empty. He had no gold, No prospects, no plan. He had nothing but the worn clothes on his back and a lame mule waiting for him miles away. And yet, he had never felt richer. He didn't leave. The days bled into weeks. Jed fell into a new rhythm, a life dictated by the sun and the seasons, not by the frantic search for wealth. He hunted for them both, his skills as a woodsman finding a new and nobler purpose. He learned to track deer and rabbit, to find water where none seemed to exist, to read the stories written in the bent grass and the disturbed stones. He repaired Nache's shelter, reinforcing it against the winter winds. He listened. He learned the names of the plants, not for what they were worth, but for what they could do, which ones could heal a wound, which could soothe a fever, which could be woven into a strong cord. He and Nache rarely spoke of the events in the canyon. There was no need. The past was buried. Their conversations were of other things, of the coyote's cleverness, of the way the stars shifted with the turning of the year, of the old stories of the Apache people. Jed learned of a wealth measured in memory, in wisdom, in the intricate, sacred connection between a people and their land. He was no longer a prospector taking from the earth. He was a student learning from it. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky, Jed saw it. The same kind of light that had illuminated the flakes of gold in his pan now bathed the entire landscape in a breathtaking glow. The Chiricahua Mountains burned with a light far more precious than any metal. He looked at the old, blind man beside him, whose sightless eyes seemed to absorb the beauty more deeply than Jed's ever could. He understood then that the map Nache had given him had not been a test of his greed, but a guide. It had led him not to a treasure he could possess, but to one he could become a part of. He was no longer Jedediah Stone, the failed farmer, the desperate prospector. He was just a man, sitting on the earth, finally at peace. He was home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.